Imagine dedicating your life to someone only to realize they see you as nothing more than a common servant. This Duchess was about to marry the most arrogant man in the kingdom, but she had a secret that would shatter his world. What happens when his maid turns out to be the woman he's pledged to marry? Can a man truly love a woman he despises? This is the story of a powerful Duchess disguised as a humble servant who decides to test her fiancé's true character. You won't believe the look on his face when her true identity is revealed, turning his condescending world completely upside down. Ever wished you could expose someone's true colors without them ever seeing it coming? Our Duchess felt the same way about her insufferably arrogant fiancé. She swapped her silks for rags, but when her true status is unveiled, his shock and humiliation are absolutely priceless. Get ready for the ultimate comeuppance. The autumn rain drummed against the diamond-paned windows of Raven's Hollow Manor like urgent fingers tapping secrets into the ancient stone walls. In the grand library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that had witnessed centuries of whispered conspiracies, Lady Isabella Montclair stood before an ornate gilded mirror, her emerald eyes reflecting a storm far fiercer than the one raging across the Yorkshire countryside. "Your Grace, surely you cannot be serious about this dangerous endeavor," whispered Margaret, her lady-in-waiting clutching her lace handkerchief with trembling hands. The golden flames from the massive stone fireplace danced across Isabella's porcelain features, casting shadows that seemed to whisper of the perilous plan taking shape in her brilliant mind. Isabella's slender fingers traced the rough edges of a simple servant's dress laid across the mahogany writing desk where her grandfather had once penned letters to kings. The coarse brown wool felt foreign against her skin, so utterly different from the French silks that had adorned her since birth. "Margaret, I have heard whispers about Lord Adrian Blackthorne for months. They say he treats his staff like dirt beneath his polished boots, yet when he courts me he speaks of honor and respect." The ancient manor creaked around them, its Georgian bones settling into foundations laid 3 centuries ago. Through tall windows, Isabella could see the formal gardens where she had played as a child, now shrouded in mist that echoed the uncertainty clouding her heart. "If I am to spend my life with this man, I must know who he truly is when he believes no one of consequence is watching." Margaret's voice rose with desperation. "But Your Grace, if you are discovered, the scandal would destroy everything. Your reputation, your standing in society, all of it would be ruined forever." Isabella turned from the window, her reflection caught between flames and storm-darkened glass. "Then I shall know the man I am meant to marry for exactly who he is," she replied with iron determination. "A woman's fate should not be sealed by contracts signed in drawing rooms by men who speak of her as if she were a prize mare." As dawn broke over Yorkshire, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Isabella began her transformation. Margaret worked with shaking hands to braid her mistress's lustrous auburn hair into a simple knot, hiding its natural shine beneath a plain cap. The servant's dress hung loose on Isabella's frame, and she deliberately smudged dirt beneath her fingernails and across her cheek. "Remember," Isabella whispered, practicing the regional accent she had learned from kitchen maids, "I am Bella from the village, newly hired to help with the engagement celebrations. I know nothing of Lady Isabella except that she is expected to marry Lord Blackthorne." The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the arrival that would change everything. From the servants' hall, Isabella watched through a crack in the door as Lord Adrian Blackthorne's impressive procession halted in the circular drive. His coach was a masterpiece of black lacquer and gold leaf, pulled by 4 perfectly matched bay horses that spoke of wealth and impeccable taste. The man who emerged was handsome in the classical sense, tall, lean, with dark hair and aristocratic features that had made him the subject of admiring whispers in London drawing rooms. But it was his eyes that made Isabella's breath catch not from admiration but from recognition of their coldness. They swept over the assembled servants with no acknowledgement of their humanity. "You there?" His voice boomed across the entry hall with practiced authority. "What are you gawking at? Have you never seen a proper gentleman before?" Isabella stepped forward, forcing herself to adopt the submissive posture she had observed in countless interactions between masters and staff. Every instinct screamed to meet his gaze with the authority of her true station. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the marble floor. "Forgive me, my lord. I am new to service here." Lord Blackthorne's laugh was sharp and unforgiving. "New to service? Well, that explains the vacant stare. What is your name, girl?" "Bella, my lord," Isabella managed, each word feeling like swallowing glass. "I was hired from the village to help with your engagement celebration." "Well, Bella from the village. See that you learn quickly. I have no patience for incompetent servants." The last chambermaid who dared to look me in the eye found herself cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back. Over the following days, Isabella's education in her fiancé's true character proved more disturbing than she had ever imagined. She witnessed him striking young Thomas, a 14-year-old footman, for accidentally brushing against his coat while serving breakfast. The boy fell to his knees from the force of the blow, blood trickling from his split lip. "Clumsy fool," Lord Blackthorne roared. "Do you think my clothing exists for your grubby hands to soil? You will work without wages for a month to pay for cleaning this coat." Isabella, holding a tray against the wall, had to bite her tongue until it bled to keep from crying out. Every fiber of her being screamed to reveal herself, to protect the boy from such casual cruelty. But she forced herself to remain silent, absorbing this lesson and what her future might hold. The next day brought even worse when he reduced Mrs. Hartwell, the cook Isabella had known since childhood, to tears over soup that was served warm instead of scalding hot. "This is what you call soup?" he demanded, pushing the bowl away with such force it nearly overturned. "I have eaten slop from prison kitchens that showed more care than this lukewarm dishwater." Mrs. Hartwell's round face crumpled as she tried to explain, but Lord Blackthorne cut her off. "What pride could a servant possibly have? You exist to serve your betters, not to take pride in menial labor. Perhaps a week without wages will help you remember your purpose." Isabella watched the woman who had been like a second mother to her being, humiliated over something so trivial it defied belief. She began to understand the atmosphere of fear that governed the servants' daily lives, people walking on razor's edge, knowing their livelihoods could vanish at a master's whim. But most revealing was how Lord Blackthorne's behavior changed like a chameleon depending on his audience. When local gentry came to call, he transformed into the charming gentleman who had won her parents' approval. Isabella watched from behind a door as he entertained Sir Reginald Pembroke in the same breakfast room where he had struck Thomas hours earlier. "I confess myself the most fortunate of men," he declared with apparent sincerity. "Lady Isabella is everything a gentleman could desire, beautiful, accomplished, and possessed of that rare quality in a woman, the wisdom to trust her husband's judgment. She shows no signs of those unfortunate modern notions about equality." Sir Reginald raised his brandy glass. "You are indeed fortunate. The Montclair women understand their proper role. Lady Isabella will never trouble you with unwelcome opinions or unfeminine assertiveness." "Precisely," Lord Blackthorne agreed, his smile revealing perfect teeth that Isabella now knew could deliver cutting cruelty as easily as charming compliments. "I have no patience for modern women who fill their heads with radical notions. A wife's calling is to support her husband and raise his children." This contrast between his public and private faces disturbed Isabella more than simple cruelty might have. A consistently harsh man might be changed or avoided, but one who calculated his cruelty while presenting virtue to those who mattered socially was far more dangerous. It was during a quiet afternoon that Isabella encountered the most damning evidence, hidden behind library curtains while dusting. She overheard Lord Blackthorne speaking with his valet about his upcoming marriage. "The Montclair fortune will serve my purposes admirably," he said with casual satisfaction. "As for the girl, she seems biddable enough from our brief meetings." "Pretty certainly, but I doubt there's much substance beneath those curls." His valet chuckled sycophantically. "And her appearance, my lord, adequate for producing handsome children and looking well on my arm. More importantly, women of her class are bred for decoration rather than conversation. I've observed her carefully. She never contradicts or questions, shows proper deference. I doubt she's ever had an original thought, which suits me perfectly." Isabella's hands clenched around her dusting cloth as she listened to herself being discussed like livestock. But Lord Blackthorne wasn't finished. "Should she prove more spirited than expected, she'll learn her place just as these servants have. I've found that a firm hand applied early prevents years of trouble. Women, like horses, respond to clear demonstrations of who holds the reins." The casual way he spoke of breaking her spirit made Isabella press against the wall, fighting waves of nausea. This was the man who had written her poetry, who had convinced her parents of his deep respect for their family values. The next evening brought an announcement that would provide the perfect stage for confrontation. Lord Blackthorne stood in the great hall beneath painted ancestors and raised his crystal goblet. "Tomorrow evening we celebrate not just my engagement, but the union of two families whose names have shaped English history." He warmed to his theme, his voice carrying through the assembled conservative crowd. "Lady Isabella represents everything finest in English womanhood, beautiful, accomplished in appropriate arts, and possessed of that rarest feminine virtue, the wisdom to recognize masculine authority. She understands that a wife's highest calling is to defer to her husband's judgment without the distraction of feminine interference. The approving murmurs and raised glasses filled Isabella with cold fury. She had played their expected role perfectly, suppressing her intelligence to meet their definition of ideal wife. Tomorrow night that performance would end forever. The day of the engagement ball dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through Ravens Hollow Manor's tall windows. The estate hummed with preparation as servants transformed the ancient halls into a glittering wonderland. Isabella moved through her final day of servitude with calculated precision, gathering evidence for the evening's revelation. But fresh horrors awaited. She watched Lord Blackthorne berate Mr. Davies, the elderly head gardener whose family had served the Montclairs for 4 generations. His expertise with roses was legendary, but his arrangements were dismissed with casual cruelty. "These arrangements are completely unacceptable," Lord Blackthorne declared in the morning room where generations of Montclair brides had received guests. "The colors clash. The proportions are grotesque. Tonight reflects my standards, not moldy family customs. Remake them immediately, or your employment ends today." Isabella watched her childhood friend bow in defeat and begin dismantling arrangements that represented decades of knowledge and family tradition. The sight filled her with winter-cold fury. Throughout the morning, the reign of terror continued. He dismissed chambermaid Mary for humming while dusting, claiming her cheerfulness showed disrespect. The girl burst into tears as she was ordered to leave immediately without references. "Let this be a lesson," he announced to assembled servants. "You exist to serve your betters, not express yourselves or take pleasure in work." But the most disturbing moment came during afternoon when Isabella overheard Lord Blackthorne entertaining London cronies in the morning room. Hidden in the servants' corridor, she listened as he discussed marriage plans with casual cruelty. "The beauty of this arrangement," he told his companions, "is everything works to my advantage. The fortune solves my financial difficulties, the connections provide political power, and the girl is so malleable that reshaping her should prove effortless." Lord Pemberton laughed appreciatively. "And, if she proves less tractable than expected?" Lord Blackthorne's confidence was chilling. "Then I'll apply lessons learned from my late father, who understood how to train a wife to proper obedience. A few strategic corrections, careful isolation from interfering family, and even the most spirited woman learns to accept absolute authority." The conversation that followed detailed his plans for systematically destroying her confidence, cutting her off from supportive relationships, and using financial control and social isolation to ensure complete dependence. Isabella remained frozen long after they left, processing the fate that awaited her if this marriage proceeded. As evening shadows lengthened, Isabella prepared for the transformation that would restore her true identity or destroy her completely. Margaret waited with the gown specially created for this night, midnight blue silk that captured starlight, with sapphires at the throat matching the fire in Isabella's eyes. "Your Grace," Margaret whispered as she worked, "once tonight is over, there will be no returning to the way things were." Isabella studied her reflection as her true self emerged. Her auburn hair fell in lustrous waves, her skin glowed with pearl-like luminescence, and the Montclair sapphires blazed at her throat like captured midnight sky. The tiara that had adorned Queen seemed to burn with cold fire against her hair. "Margaret, I have learned more about marriage in these past weeks than years of courtship lessons could teach. Tonight I wield knowledge as my weapon." The grand ballroom had been transformed into glittering fantasy that would impress the most jaded London socialites. Hundreds of beeswax candles cast dancing shadows across gold and emerald silk walls, while crystal chandeliers threw light like fallen stars. The cream of Yorkshire society mingled beneath painted ceilings depicting classical gods, their voices creating symphonies of cultured conversation. Lord Adrian Blackthorne stood at the center, resplendent in evening wear crafted by London's finest tailors. He moved through the crowd with conquering general confidence, accepting congratulations with the bearing of someone who had never doubted his superiority. "But where is your lovely bride to be?" inquired the Countess of Whitmore, her fan fluttering with curiosity. "I confess eagerness to meet the woman who captured Yorkshire's most eligible bachelor's heart." Lord Blackthorne's smile was practiced to perfection. "Lady Isabella's making final preparations. You know how particular women can be about appearance when they're the center of attention?" He warmed to his favorite theme, though she hardly needs concern herself. Her greatest assets aren't physical beauty, but perfect understanding of a woman's proper role. She possesses that rarest feminine virtuism to defer to masculine judgment. Approving murmurs rippled through the conservative gathering. Sir Reginald Pembroke raised his champagne glass. How refreshing to hear of a young woman who understands natural order. Too many have been infected with dangerous notions about feminine independence. Lord Blackthorne preened under approval. Indeed. I've observed Lady Isabella carefully, and she displays none of those unfortunate modern tendencies. She speaks when spoken to, never presumes to offer opinions beyond her understanding, and shows proper appreciation for the honor being bestowed. He continued holding court like a medieval king, speaking of marriage plans and expectations with absolute certainty. Lady Isabella will make the ideal wife precisely because she lacks troublesome independence. She possesses the invaluable quality of knowing when to speak and, more importantly, when to remain silent. The hearty, approving laughter was suddenly interrupted by commotion near the ballroom entrance. The massive oak doors carved with Montclair's arms swung open as the butler's voice rang with practiced formality. Lady Isabella Montclair, Duchess of Ravenshollow. The ballroom fell into absolute silence. Isabella made her entrance with theatrical timing that would envy London's finest actresses. She moved with fluid grace, each step calculated for maximum impact, her midnight blue gown rustling like whispered secrets promising earth-shattering revelations. The transformation was so stunning that several guests audibly gasped. The sapphires at her throat caught candlelight and threw back brilliant azure flames, while the Montclair tiara blazed like captured starlight. But her eyes commanded true attention, emerald fire speaking of intelligence, determination, and dangerous knowledge. Lord Blackthorne's face underwent transformation that would have been comical if not so perfectly deserved. His practiced smile faltered like candle flame in hurricane, crumbling as recognition dawned. Color drained from aristocratic cheeks, leaving him pale as winter moonlight, mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Impossible, he breathed, barely audible above collective breath intake from 300 sophisticated observers. Isabella glided across the ballroom floor with serene confidence, never breaking eye contact as she catalogued every nuance of his shock and growing horror. Reaching the center beneath the largest chandelier, she positioned herself so every person would have clear view of unfolding drama. She executed a perfect curtsy that managed to be both respectful and mocking, sapphires catching light as she bent her head in apparent submission. Rising, her smile was winter sunshine, beautiful, brilliant, and absolutely deadly. Lord Blackthorne, her voice carried clearly through stunned silence. How wonderful to see you again in such elevated circumstances, though you look as if you've seen a ghost. Surely you remember your devoted bride too, B. Whispers began circulating like wildfire as guests sensed extraordinary drama, though they hadn't grasped its full scope. Lord Blackthorne attempted to recover composure, forcing practiced smile back into place like hastily donned armor. Lady Isabella, he managed, voice slightly less steady than usual. You look different tonight, more radiant than I've ever seen you. Isabella's smile grew more dangerous, like ice forming on pond, promising to crack under additional pressure. Though I wonder if you would have found me quite so radiant when you knew me as Bella, the humble servant girl who has been cleaning your chambers and serving your meals for the past fortnight. Whispers died entirely, replaced by silence so profound that crackling fireplace logs sounded like thunderclaps. Lord Blackthorne's mask shattered completely, leaving naked horror and dawning comprehension. You see, my lord, Isabella continued, beginning to pace around him like lioness circling wounded prey. I wanted to know the man I was meant to marry. Not the polished suitor who courts duchesses in drawing rooms, but the real man who emerges when unobserved by social equals. Each word hit the crowd like physical blows. In Victorian England's rigid social hierarchies, while cruelty to servants was often overlooked, public exposure meant social suicide. I watched you strike young Thomas for accidentally brushing your coat. I heard you reduce Mrs. Hartwell to tears over soup that was merely warm. I listened as you boasted about my tractability and described your plans to break my spirit through strategic corrections and careful isolation. The ballroom erupted in shocked gasps. Isabella turned to address the crowd directly, her bearing every inch the Duchess born to command. Ladies and gentlemen, you came to celebrate my engagement to Lord Blackthorne. Instead, witness its complete dissolution. I have learned that a man showing cruelty to those he perceives, beneath him will inevitably show that same cruelty to anyone falling under his power, including the wife he believes he owns. Lord Blackthorne made desperate final attempt at salvage. Isabella, surely you understand. Our families, the contracts, your reputation, my reputation will recover from breaking engagement to a cruel man. Isabella's interruption cut through his excuses like blade through silk. Your reputation, however, will not recover from being exposed as exactly that. With deliberate ceremony, She removed the engagement ring massive diamond that had belonged to his grandmother and held it to candlelight where it caught flame and threw back rainbow sparks mocking the promises it once symbolized. "I return your ring, Lord Blackthorn," she declared, opening her fingers and letting it fall to marble floor where it skittered away with sound like breaking dreams. "And thank you for the education. You taught me that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or bloodlines, and everything to do with how we treat those who cannot defend themselves." She gathered her midnight skirts and walked toward the ballroom doors, head high and shoulders squared with confidence of a woman who had chosen her own destiny. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, faces mixing shock, admiration, and scandal-hungry anticipation of gossip that would fuel conversations for years. Pausing at the doorway, Isabella looked back one final time at the man who might have been her husband. Lord Blackthorn stood alone in the ballroom center, isolated in empty space, as if disgrace were contagious, while Yorkshire's finest society watched his complete social destruction. "Oh, and Lord Blackthorn," she called out, voice carrying like midnight bell, "you might want to apologize to Thomas, Mrs. Hartwell, and all the others. After tonight you'll need every ally you can find." The aftermath rippled through English high society like stones cast into still water, creating expanding scandal circles reaching from Yorkshire countryside to London drawing rooms. By morning, every household within 50 miles knew the tale. By week's end, it had reached the capital, growing more elaborate with each telling. Consequences for Lord Blackthorn were swift and devastating. Before guests departed Ravenshollow Manor, he transformed from celebrated bridegroom to social pariah. Invitations suddenly stopped arriving, business associates avoided his gaze, and servants throughout the county whispered warnings about his household. Within a month, his financial situation deteriorated as investments were withdrawn, loans called in, and partnerships dissolved with civilized brutality characterizing upper-class business dealings. The Montclair fortune, foundation of his plans, was forever beyond reach, and social connections that marriage would have provided became liabilities overnight. Isabella discovered her bold action created unexpected consequences. While facing whispers from conservative society, she found herself surrounded by allies praising her courage in choosing truth over convenience. Progressive thinkers hailed her as women's rights pioneer, proof that intelligence and conviction could triumph over social convention. More surprisingly, servants throughout the country began speaking her name with reverence, passing down the story of the Duchess who voluntarily descended to their level to understand their experiences. Her willingness to see through their eyes elevated her from distant aristocrat to genuine champion. 3 months later, Isabella stood again in her library where the adventure began. Margaret sat nearby, no longer merely lady-in-waiting but confidant and friend relationship forged through shared conspiracy and mutual respect. "Your Grace," Margaret said, organizing daily correspondence from across England and the continent, another marriage proposal. This from Lord William Ashford of Kent, whose reputation suggests actual worthiness. Isabella smiled, reading the refreshingly honest letter. Instead of flowery devotion proclamations based on beauty and fortune, Lord Ashford wrote about being impressed by her intelligence and courage. More remarkably, he proposed partnership founded on mutual respect and shared values rather than traditional courtship. "He's offered me a governess position with his nieces should I wish to repeat my ... experiment. It seems my reputation, as the Duchess who tests suitors, has preceded me." Margaret laughed brightly. "It appears your methods have inspired new courtship approaches. I've heard young women throughout England are finding creative ways to observe intended husbands when those men believe themselves unobserved." Indeed. What began as Isabella's personal truth quest had evolved into social movement. Young women disguised themselves as shopgirls to watch suitors interact with tradespeople, took governess positions to observe how potential husbands treated children and servants. The practice spawned new profession agencies specializing in placing temporary staff, who were actually prospective brides conducting covert investigations. As Isabella watched her estate's servants, now treated with unprecedented dignity thanks to reforms she instituted, a familiar carriage arrived. A young woman in servant's clothing approached with movements suggesting careful preparation and nervous determination. Something about her bearing reminded Isabella powerfully of herself months before. "Margaret," she said excitedly, "I believe we have another conspirator seeking guidance. Please invite her through the main entrance. She's lived below station quite long enough." The visitor proved to be Lady Catherine Pembroke, Sir Reginald's daughter. Inspired by Isabella's confrontation to investigate her own questionable suitor, as the three women planned Catherine's masquerade in the library that witnessed Isabella's original transformation, Isabella realized her single rebellion had become something far more significant. "We're not simply exposing individual cruel men," she declared, raising her teacup in mock toast carrying revolutionary weight. "We're challenging the entire system, allowing such men to prosper by preying on women's ignorance and society's expectations. We're starting a quiet revolution of knowledge." Throughout England and increasingly across Europe, the Montclair method was transforming courtship and marriage among upper classes. Women once expected to accept suitors based solely on family. Recommendations now demanded the right to make informed decisions based on actual character knowledge. The practice led to unprecedented broken engagements as women discovered charming suitors were actually cruel masters, financial swindlers, or incompatible personalities skilled at maintaining attractive facades. But it also increased marriages based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect, proving more stable than traditional economic and social arrangements. Years later, historians studying Victorian women's rights evolution identified Isabella's engagement ball as a pivotal moment in transforming marriage from purely economic transaction into partnership between equals. Her story became legend, passed through generations as proof that courage, intelligence, and moral conviction could triumph over social convention. Lord Blackthorne eventually left England entirely, seeking fresh opportunities in America where his reputation hadn't preceded him. But servants have long memories and networks spanning oceans, and his true nature became known even in chosen exile. Isabella eventually married Lord William Ashford after courtship involving complete honesty and thorough character investigation that shocked contemporaries. Their wedding celebrated not just romantic love, but the revolutionary idea that marriage should be partnership between people who truly knew and respected each other's authentic selves. The ballroom at Ravenshollow Manor, scene of that fateful confrontation, was converted into library and meeting hall where women from across the country shared experiences and planned investigations into masculine character. Isabella insisted the marble floor where she dropped Lord Blackthorne's ring be preserved exactly as it was, marked with brass plaque reminding visitors that the most powerful revolutions sometimes begin with single acts of defiance by those brave enough to choose knowledge over ignorance. The servants' quarters were transformed into comfortable apartments, becoming the envy of domestic staff throughout Yorkshire, proving that treating people with dignity was not only morally right but practically beneficial. Isabella's reforms became models for other great houses, gradually improving conditions for thousands who had previously existed at master's mercy. In years following, Isabella's influence extended far beyond individual relationships. She patronized schools educating young women in practical skills like accounting and law that would allow them to protect their interests in marriage and beyond. Her funding established the first agencies investigating suitors' financial status and personal character. The story of the Duchess, who disguised herself as servant to test her fiancé's character, spread across continents, inspiring women in France, Germany, Italy, and even reaching American colonies where it was told as proof that even the seemingly powerless could claim agency over their destinies. 20 years after that dramatic evening, Isabella prepared her own daughter, Lady Margaret Ashford, for her first London season. The 18-year-old possessed the same intelligent green eyes and independent spirit that had made her mother such a formidable change agent. "Remember, my dear," Isabella said, "helping with court presentation preparations, beauty and fortune may attract suitors, but character and compatibility determine lifelong happiness. Never fear asking questions, observing carefully, and trusting instincts about men seeking your hand." Young Lady Margaret smiled with confidence of a woman raised believing in her own worth. "And if I need to disguise myself as governess or shop girl to learn someone's character," Isabella's laugh was warm with pride, "then you'll have learned the most important lesson I can teach, that knowledge is power. Truth is sacred, and no social convention is worth sacrificing happiness or dignity." As they prepared to enter London society, Isabella reflected on how completely the world had changed since that autumn evening when she first put on a servant's dress. The naive young woman who had agreed to marry Lord Blackthorne based on family recommendations was gone forever, replaced by someone understanding that the most important battles were often fought with quiet courage to see clearly, and act on that vision regardless of consequences. The legacy of that evening continued rippling through time, touching lives Isabella would never know but whose stories echoed hers in themes of courage, truth, and the revolutionary power of choosing knowledge over comfortable ignorance. In drawing rooms across England, young women raised teacups toasting the Duchess who had shocked her arrogant fiancé and opened doors for all who followed. In Ravenshollow Manor's great ballroom, now serving as library and meeting place for women claiming control over their destinies, Afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting prismatic rainbows across marble floors where a diamond ring had once fallen with the sound of breaking dreams and promise of new possibilities. The brass plaque near that spot bore simple inscription capturing Isabella's legacy essence. Here stood a woman who chose knowledge over ignorance, truth over comfort, and her own judgment over society's expectations. May all who read these words find courage to see clearly and act with integrity, whatever consequences may be. The story that began with whispered rumors and desperate curiosity had transformed into something far greater, testament to individual courage's power to change not just single lives but entire societies, one honest choice at a time. The Duchess who shocked her arrogant fiancé had done far more than expose one man's cruelty. She had illuminated paths toward more just and honest worlds, proving that even in rigid hierarchies, truth has power to set hearts and minds free. Isabella Montclair achieved something neither beauty nor wealth could provide. She became legendary not for what she inherited, but for what she chose to do with gifts and opportunities placed in her path. Her story lived as proof that the most effective way to change the world is often simply having courage to see it clearly, even when that vision requires humbling ourselves, challenging assumptions, and walking bravely into unknown territories where truth matters more than comfort and integrity counts more than convention. The revolution she started with servant's dress and determination to know truth had grown beyond anything imaginable, touching countless lives and reshaping society's very foundation of understanding love, marriage, and the eternal human quest for authentic connection in a world too often built on beautiful lies and comfortable deceptions. 5 years had passed since that transformative evening at Ravenshollow Manor, and Isabella's influence had spread far beyond the boundaries of Yorkshire society. What began as a personal quest for truth had evolved into a movement that was quietly reshaping the very fabric of English matrimonial customs. But with success came unexpected challenges that would test Isabella's resolve in ways she had never anticipated. The morning fog rolled across the grounds of Ashford Hall in Kent, where Isabella now resided as the respected wife of Lord William Ashford. Their marriage had become a beacon of hope for progressive couples throughout England, proving that unions based on mutual understanding and genuine affection could flourish even in an age of arranged conveniences. Yet as Isabella stood in her morning room, reading through a stack of increasingly desperate letters, she realized that her revolution had attracted the attention of forces far more dangerous than social gossip. My dear Lord William entered the room, his face creased with concern as he observed his wife's troubled expression. "You've been staring at those letters for the better part of an hour. What news troubles you so?" Isabella held up a letter bearing the elaborate seal of Lord Chancellor Brougham himself. "It seems our methods have reached the highest echelons of government, William. The Chancellor writes to inform me that certain members of Parliament are expressing concern about what they term the growing epidemic of feminine rebellion spreading throughout the kingdom." The letter detailed complaints from influential peers whose sons and business associates had found themselves exposed and humiliated by young women, employing what had become known as the Ravenshollow strategy. Several prominent families had petitioned the government to investigate Isabella's activities, claiming that she was corrupting the moral fiber of English womanhood and undermining the natural order that had governed society for centuries. Lord William took the letter, his expression darkening as he read the Chancellor's carefully worded warning. The government, while not prepared to take official action, strongly suggested that Lady Isabella might wish to consider moderating her influence on impressionable young women. There were hints of potential consequences should the situation continue to escalate, whispers of investigations into seditious activities, questions about loyalty to crown and country. "They're frightened," Isabella said quietly, moving to the window where she could see the gardens she and William had designed together. Spaces where beauty and function coexisted in harmony rather than rigid hierarchy. Not of individual women making informed choices about marriage, but of what happens when those individual choices become collective action. They understand that knowledge is power, and they're terrified of what happens when that power shifts from men to women. But the governmental pressure was only one of several threats converging on Isabella's newfound peace. A second letter, this one bearing no seal but written in an elegant feminine hand, brought news that struck much closer to home. Lady Catherine Pembroke, the young woman Isabella had helped disguise as a governess to investigate her suitor, had been discovered in her masquerade under circumstances that threatened to destroy not only her own reputation but Isabella's credibility as well. The discovery had come about through the machinations of Lord Pembroke's intended victim, a man named Sir Marcus Thornfield, whose cruelty towards servants had been legendary until Catherine's investigation exposed him to public scrutiny. Unlike Lord Blackthorne, who had fled England in shame, Sir Marcus had chosen to fight back with the ruthless cunning that had made his fortune in the colonial trade. Sir Marcus had hired private investigators to trace the source of what he correctly suspected was organized feminine espionage. His inquiries had led him to Isabella, and armed with evidence of her activities, he was now threatening to expose not just Catherine's masquerade, but the entire network of women who had employed similar tactics to investigate their suitors. "The man is demanding compensation," Isabella explained to William as she read aloud from Catherine's tearful account. "Not just for his damaged reputation, but for what he claims is a systematic campaign of defamation, orchestrated by women who refuse to accept their natural subordination to masculine authority. He's threatening to take his evidence to the newspapers, to make public spectacle of every woman who has ever used deception to learn the truth about a potential husband." The third letter brought perhaps the most unexpected challenge of all. It came from Isabella's own mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshollow, whose pride in her daughter's marriage to Lord William had been tempered by growing concern about the social implications of Isabella's continued activism. The Dowager Duchess wrote with the careful diplomacy of a woman who had navigated the treacherous waters of high society for 4 decades, but her message was unmistakably clear. The Montclair family name, which had been synonymous with respectability and conservative values for generations, was becoming associated with radical ideas that threatened their standing among England's most influential families. Several potential marriages for Isabella's younger cousins had been cancelled when prospective bridegrooms' families expressed concerns about welcoming connections to revolutionary elements into their lineage. Business partnerships that had been cultivated over decades were being reconsidered, and invitations to the most exclusive social events were no longer extended to family members. "She's asking me to choose," Isabella said softly, her voice heavy with the weight of impossible decisions between continuing my work and preserving the family legacy. "Mother doesn't understand that what I'm doing isn't rebellion for its own sake, but an attempt to create a world where women can enter marriage with dignity and knowledge rather than ignorance and hope." William took her hands in his, studying her face with the deep understanding that had made their relationship so remarkable. "And what do you intend to do? The pressure you're facing would break most people, male or female. No one would blame you for stepping back, for allowing others to carry forward what you've begun." Isabella's response came not in words but in action. Moving to her writing desk, a beautiful piece crafted by the same artisan who had made furniture for Queen Victoria herself, she began composing letters that would change the course of her movement forever. But instead of retreating or compromising, she was planning the most audacious expansion of her activities yet attempted. The first letter went to Lady Catherine Pembroke, offering not just moral support but a concrete solution to her dilemma. Instead of allowing Sir Marcus to destroy her reputation through exposure, Isabella proposed that Catherine take the offensive by publicly announcing her investigation and its results. The revelation would be carefully choreographed to maximize its impact while minimizing the potential for retaliation. The second letter was addressed to a woman she had never met, but whose reputation for brilliance and social activism had reached Isabella through progressive circles throughout England. Miss Frances Wright was an American writer and reformer who had been advocating for women's rights with a boldness that scandalized conservative society but inspired progressive thinkers on both sides of the Atlantic. Isabella's letter proposed an alliance that would transform her individual actions into an organized movement capable of withstanding governmental pressure and social opposition. She offered to share her methods and findings with Miss Wright's networks in America, while requesting guidance on how to formalize and protect the activities of women throughout England who were employing similar investigative techniques. The third letter went to her mother, but its contents were far from the capitulation the Dowager Duchess had undoubtedly hoped to receive. Instead, Isabella wrote with the respectful but firm tone of a woman who had found her calling and would not be deterred by family pressure or social expectations. She acknowledged the risks to the family name, but argued that true nobility lay not in preserving outdated traditions but in pioneering positive change that would benefit future generations. The Montclair legacy, she suggested, should be one of courage and moral leadership rather than mere conformity to established patterns. As she sealed the final letter, Isabella felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that had characterized her most important decisions. The governmental threats, the blackmail attempts, the family pressure, all of these could be overcome through careful planning and strategic action. But the stakes had risen far beyond her personal happiness or even her family's reputation. What she was contemplating would transform her from individual rebel into leader of organized resistance to centuries of tradition and legal precedent. The women who looked to her for guidance would be exposed to risks far greater than social embarrassment, and the men who opposed them would respond with weapons far more dangerous than mere gossip. Yet as Isabella looked out at the gardens where she and William had created something beautiful together through cooperation and mutual respect rather than domination and submission, she knew that retreat was impossible. Too many women had already found courage to question their circumstances, and too many had discovered that knowledge truly was power worth any risk to obtain. The revolution that had begun with a servant's dress and a determination to know the truth was about to enter its most dangerous and decisive phase. The battles ahead would be fought not just in ballrooms and drawing rooms, but in parliament and courtrooms, in newspapers and public squares. Wherever the fundamental questions of power and justice demanded answers that society was not yet ready to provide. 2 weeks after sending her letters, Isabella found herself standing in the drawing room of an elegant townhouse in London's fashionable Bloomsbury district, surrounded by women whose faces reflected the same mixture of determination and apprehension she felt in her own heart. What had begun as informal correspondence between like-minded individuals had evolved into the first organized meeting of what they had decided to call the Society for Matrimonial Truth, a name that managed to sound respectable while concealing the revolutionary nature of their activities. Miss Frances Wright had arrived from America with a delegation of reformers whose experience in challenging established authority would prove invaluable in the battles ahead. Beside her sat Lady Catherine Pembroke, whose decision to publicly reveal her investigation of Sir Marcus Thornfield had created a sensation in London society while inspiring dozens of other women to share their own stories. The room buzzed with animated conversation as women from across England shared accounts of their investigations, their discoveries, and their growing understanding that individual experiences of masculine cruelty and deception were part of systematic patterns rather than isolated incidents. What had begun as personal quests for truth had revealed widespread abuse of power that extended far beyond the realm of marriage into business, politics, and social relationships at every level. "The evidence we've gathered," Isabella said, addressing the assembled group with the confidence of someone who had learned to command attention through moral authority rather than inherited privilege, demonstrates that the problem extends far beyond individual bad actors. We're confronting a system that actively encourages and protects behavior that would be considered criminal if directed towards social equals rather than social inferiors. She had prepared detailed presentations documenting patterns they had discovered through their collective investigations. Men who were cruel to servants invariably proved cruel to wives. Those who cheated business partners also cheated on marriage vows. The correlation between how a man treated those he considered beneath him and how he treated those bound to him through legal or social contracts was so consistent that it could be considered a reliable predictor of character. Miss Wright leaned forward, her sharp intellect immediately grasping the implications of what Isabella was presenting. "What you're describing isn't just personal misconduct. It's evidence of systematic oppression maintained through deliberate ignorance and social conditioning. The question isn't whether individual women should protect themselves through investigation, but whether society should continue tolerating structures that make such protection necessary." The conversation that followed transformed Isabella's understanding of her own actions and their potential consequences. What she had conceived as a method for helping women make better individual choices was actually a direct challenge to fundamental assumptions about power, authority, and the nature of relationships between different social groups. Lady Catherine, whose own experience had moved her from naive compliance to sophisticated analysis of social patterns, raised questions that struck to the heart of their dilemma. If we continue to expand our activities, we'll eventually force a confrontation with authority structures that have remained unchallenged for centuries. Are we prepared for the kind of response that will provoke? And more importantly, do we have the right to expose other women to risks they may not fully understand? The debate that ensued revealed the full complexity of the situation they faced. Some argued for caution, suggesting that gradual change through individual actions would be safer and more sustainable than direct confrontation with established power. Others insisted that systematic problems required systematic solutions, and that half measures would only allow abusive patterns to continue while giving the illusion of progress. Isabella found herself caught between these perspectives, understanding the validity of both while feeling the weight of responsibility for women who looked to her for leadership. The naive Duchess who had simply wanted to know her fiancé's true character had been transformed by circumstances into someone who would need to make decisions affecting thousands of lives. The meeting's turning point came when Miss Wright shared intelligence she had gathered about the opposition they faced. Sir Marcus Thornfield's threats were part of a larger campaign being orchestrated by men whose activities had been exposed through feminine investigation. They were organizing their own society, one dedicated to suppressing what they saw as dangerous rebellion against natural order. "They're preparing legal challenges to our activities," Miss Wright explained, her American directness cutting through English politeness to reveal uncomfortable truths. "Claims that organized feminine deception constitutes fraud, that our investigations violate privacy rights, that we're engaging in conspiracy to defame respectable citizens. They have the advantage of existing legal structures, political connections, and financial resources that we lack, but they also had vulnerabilities that careful strategy could exploit. Their opposition to feminine investigation was fundamentally an admission that they had behavior to hide. Their insistence on maintaining secrecy around masculine conduct was an acknowledgement that public exposure would be damaging to their interests." Isabella realized that the confrontation she had been trying to avoid was actually inevitable. The choice wasn't between safety and danger, but between meeting opposition on ground of their choosing versus forcing the battle onto terrain that favored truth over privilege. "Then we move forward," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "But we do so with full knowledge of the risks and with strategies designed to protect those who join us while maximizing our chances of success." The plan they developed over the following hours was audacious in its scope and sophisticated in its execution. Instead of operating in secret and hoping to avoid notice, they would publicize their activities while building legal and political support for their right to investigate potential marriage partners. They would establish formal agencies offering investigative services to women contemplating marriage, operating openly and professionally rather than relying on informal networks and amateur deception. They would publish findings in ways that expose patterns of behavior while protecting individual privacy where possible. Most importantly, they would frame their activities not as rebellion against masculine authority, but as support for traditional values of honor, honesty, and moral behavior that many men claimed to embody but failed to demonstrate in their private conduct. The meeting concluded with the establishment of formal offices in London, Edinburgh, and Dublin, staffed by women trained in investigative techniques and legal procedures necessary to protect themselves and their clients. Isabella agreed to serve as public spokesperson for the organization, accepting that her visibility would make her primary target for retaliation while providing cover for others to work more safely. As the women departed that evening, exchanging addresses and promises of support that would sustain them through the challenges ahead, Isabella felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that had characterized every major decision in her adult life. But this time, she was not acting alone. The revolution that had begun with her individual choice to see clearly had become a movement that would either transform English society or be crushed by forces too powerful to overcome. Standing at the window of the Bloomsbury townhouse, watching carriages carry her new allies into the London night, Isabella understood that she had reached the point of no return. The consequences of her actions would now extend far beyond her personal happiness to affect the lives of women throughout the British Empire and beyond. The Duchess, who had once sought only to know her fiancé's true character, had become the leader of a movement that would challenge the very foundations of power and privilege in Victorian society. The battles ahead would test every skill she had developed and every alliance she had built, but retreat was no longer possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opponents, and new opportunities to prove that truth was indeed more powerful than tradition, that justice could triumph over privilege, and that women armed with knowledge and determination could reshape a world that had been built to deny them both. The winter of 1853 brought with it a convergence of forces that would either cement Isabella's movement as a permanent fixture in English society or destroy it entirely in a single, devastating blow. The Society for Matrimonial Truth had been operating openly for 18 months, and their success had been both remarkable and dangerous. Over 300 women had employed their services to investigate potential suitors, leading to the exposure of dozens of men whose public reputations had concealed private cruelties that would have destroyed unsuspecting wives. But success had also attracted the attention of enemies far more sophisticated and ruthless than the individual men Isabella had initially confronted. A coalition of powerful interests led by Sir Marcus Thornfield and including members of Parliament, influential clergymen, and wealthy industrialists whose sons had been exposed by the Society's investigations had been quietly building a case that would challenge not just Isabella's methods, but the very legal right of women to investigate their potential husbands. The morning that would change everything began with Isabella receiving an urgent summons to appear before a specially convened parliamentary committee investigating seditious activities. threatening the moral fabric of English society. The language was carefully crafted to suggest treason rather than social reform, and the implications were chillingly clear. If the committee ruled against her, Isabella could face criminal charges that would not only end her movement but potentially result in imprisonment or exile. Lord William found her in their private study, still in her mourning dress, staring at the official document with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts at composure. 6 years of marriage had taught him to read the subtle signs of his wife's emotional state, and he recognized the particular stillness that overcame her when facing decisions that would affect not just their personal happiness but the welfare of countless others. "They've chosen their ground carefully," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she faced. "Hey!" Parliamentary committee gives them the appearance of official authority while allowing them to control the proceedings completely. "They're not seeking justice, William. They're orchestrating a public execution designed to warn other women against following my example." The hearing was scheduled for the following week in Westminster Hall, the same ancient chamber where kings had been crowned and traitors condemned for nearly 1,000 years. The symbolism was not accidental. By holding the proceedings in the most historically significant governmental space in England, Isabella's opponents were emphasizing that her activities represented a fundamental challenge to established order that could not be tolerated. But Isabella had not survived 6 years of increasingly dangerous activism without developing political instincts of her own. As she prepared for what might be her final public appearance as leader of the Society for Matrimonial Truth, she was planning a defense that would transform the committee's intended condemnation into something entirely different. Public platform for exposing the very corruption and abuse of power that her opponents were trying to protect. The strategy sessions that followed involved not just Isabella and her closest allies from the society, but a carefully selected group of barristers, journalists, and political reformers who understood that the hearing's outcome would affect far more than women's rights to investigate potential husbands. The principles at stake, the right to seek truth, the accountability of those in power, the protection of vulnerable individuals from exploitation, were fundamental to any just society. Miss Frances Wright, who had remained in England specifically to support Isabella through this crisis, brought intelligence from her American contacts that added new dimensions to their understanding of what they faced. The opposition to Isabella's movement was part of a broader international reaction against growing demands for women's rights and social reform. Conservative forces throughout Europe and America were coordinating their responses, sharing strategies and resources to suppress what they saw as dangerous challenges to natural hierarchy. "They're afraid," Miss Wright explained during one of their late-night planning sessions, her sharp analysis cutting through the fear and uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm even Isabella's considerable courage. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of what your success represents. If English women can successfully challenge masculine authority in the most private and personal sphere of marriage, what's to stop them from demanding equal treatment in business, politics, and public life?" The hearing itself would focus on specific allegations that Isabella and her associates had engaged in fraud, conspiracy, and defamation through their investigative activities. But the real question being decided was whether women had the right to protect themselves from deception and abuse, or whether such protection threatened the social order that gave men unchallenged authority over feminine destiny. Isabella's preparation for the hearing was unlike anything she had previously undertaken. She would be testifying not just as an individual defending her actions, but as the representative of a movement that had given hope and practical assistance to thousands of women throughout the British Empire. The weight of that responsibility was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. She could not retreat or compromise without betraying everyone who had trusted her leadership. The document she assembled for her defense told a story of systematic use and institutional failure that extended far beyond individual cases of matrimonial deception. Working with the society's most experienced investigators, Isabella had compiled evidence showing that the men calling for her prosecution were often the same ones whose behavior had been exposed through her activities. More damaging still was the pattern they had uncovered of official complicity in protecting abusive men from consequences for their actions. Magistrates who dismissed servants' complaints about violent masters, clergymen who counseled wives to endure rather than escape brutal husbands, business partners who ignored evidence of financial fraud, or part of a system that enabled and protected the very behavior Isabella's movement sought to expose. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind sweeping across London that seemed to mirror the hostile atmosphere Isabella would face in Westminster Hall. As her carriage approached the ancient building where so much English history had been made, she could see crowds of people gathered outside, some supportive, others clearly antagonistic. all drawn by the unprecedented spectacle of a duchess publicly defending her right to challenge masculine authority. The hall itself was packed beyond capacity, with peers of the realm sitting alongside common citizens. Society matrons sharing benches with shopgirls who had scraped together pennies for admission. Journalists from newspapers throughout Europe preparing to report proceedings that would be read with fascination and horror across the civilized world. The committee members who would judge Isabella's fate represented the full spectrum of English establishment power conservative politicians whose careers depended on maintaining existing hierarchies, church leaders whose authority rested on traditional interpretations of masculine and feminine roles, legal authorities whose interpretations of law reflected centuries of masculine privilege. As Isabella rose to address the committee, she felt the familiar sensation of standing at a historical crossroads where individual choice would determine not just personal destiny but the future direction of society itself. The naive young woman who had once put on a servant's dress to learn her fiancé's true character was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the most important battles were fought not with weapons but with words, not through violence but through the inexorable power of truth to expose and ultimately transform injustice. Her opening statement was not a defense of her actions, but an indictment of the system that had made those actions necessary. Speaking with the clarity and moral authority that had made her a natural leader, Isabella systematically dismantled the arguments against her while presenting evidence that turned accusation into revelation. "Honorable members of this committee," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast hall to reach every person present. "You have called me here to answer charges of fraud and conspiracy. But the real fraud is a system that encourages women to enter marriage without knowledge of their husbands' true characters. The real conspiracy is the collusion between institutions and individuals to protect men from accountability for behavior that destroys lives and corrupts society." What followed was a presentation that transformed the hearing from prosecution into revolution. Isabella presented case after case of women who had been saved from disastrous marriages through the society's investigations, contrasting their stories with documented examples of women who had entered unions without such protection and suffered years of abuse, financial exploitation, psychological destruction as a result. But she went further, demonstrating how the same patterns of deception and abuse that characterized private relationships also infected public institutions and business dealings. The men demanding her prosecution were not protecting society from dangerous rebellion. They were protecting themselves from exposure of behavior that violated every moral principle they publicly claimed to uphold. The hearing continued for 3 days, during which Isabella's testimony was supported by dozens of witnesses whose accounts painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached the highest levels of English society. Women testified about husbands who had hidden gambling debts, violent tendencies, and financial fraud until after marriage made escape impossible. Servants described working conditions that bordered on slavery, enforced through threats and violence that went unpunished because victims had no legal recourse. Most damaging of all were the business associates and political allies who testified about the public behavior of men who were privately demanding Isabella's prosecution. The pattern that emerged was one of individuals who used their positions of authority to exploit and abuse others while hiding behind reputations for respectability and moral leadership. By the hearing's final day, the committee members who had expected to conduct a simple condemnation of feminine rebellion found themselves facing evidence of corruption that implicated many of their own allies and supporters. The proceedings that were meant to silence Isabella had instead provided her with the most powerful platform she had ever possessed to expose the very injustices her movement sought to address. When the committee announced its verdict, the outcome reflected the political reality that complete vindication would have required acknowledging systematic corruption throughout English society, while complete condemnation would have ignored overwhelming evidence of Isabella's moral authority and the necessity of her work. The compromise they reached was itself a victory for Isabella's movement. The Society for Matrimonial Truth would be allowed to continue its activities under new regulations designed to protect the privacy of those investigated while ensuring that their methods remained within legal bounds. Isabella would face no criminal charges, and the principle that women had the right to investigate potential husbands before marriage was officially recognized for the first time in English law. But perhaps most importantly, the hearing had accomplished what years of private activism could not. It had forced public acknowledgement that the existing system of marriage and masculine authority contained serious flaws that required systematic reform. The conversations that began in Westminster Hall would continue in drawing rooms and parliament chambers. in newspapers and universities, wherever thoughtful people gathered to discuss the fundamental questions of justice, equality, and human dignity that Isabella's courage had brought into the open. As Isabella left Westminster Hall that final afternoon, surrounded by supporters whose faces reflected the same mixture of exhaustion and triumph she felt in her own heart, she understood that she had achieved something far greater than personal vindication. The movement she had started with a servant's dress and a determination to know the truth had survived its greatest test and emerged stronger, more legitimate, and more dangerous to the forces of oppression than ever before. The Duchess who had shocked her arrogant fiancé 7 years earlier had become something unprecedented in English history, a woman whose individual courage had created permanent change in the laws and customs that governed her society. The revolution that had begun in a library at Ravenshollow Manor had reached Westminster Hall, and nothing would ever be the same again.